Two giant cracks in the earth run through Northern California right now. They stretch for over 100 miles each. They cut through forests, mountains, and small towns where families go to sleep every night with no idea what is sitting right under their houses. These cracks are capable of producing earthquakes strong enough to flatten buildings, snap water mains, collapse roofs, and cause over $1 billion in damage. And most people have never even heard their names. They are not the San Andreas fault. They are not the ones you see in movies or hear about on the news. They are two faults that sit right next to the San Andreas, running side by side with it through some of the most remote and beautiful country in California. Tall redwood trees, quiet valleys, small towns with one grocery store and one main road. For decades, these faults have been mostly quiet, just sitting there, building pressure, storing energy deep underground like a spring being pushed down tighter and tighter and tighter. But this summer, they stopped waiting, and what has happened since is unlike anything in the modern earthquake record for this part of California. In the last 10 weeks alone, these two faults have fired off a string of earthquakes that has no match in the modern record for this region. A magnitude 5.6 that cracked buildings, knocked roofs off homes, sent glass flying across sidewalks, and cut power to 10,000 people. A magnitude 4.4 that rattled dishes in towns over 100 miles away. Another 4.4 a few weeks later, then a 4.2 after that. Then a 4.5 and a 4.1 that struck just 1 second apart from each other, like the earth was throwing a 1-2 punch at the surface. And here is what makes all of this so unusual. Some of these earthquakes are the first of their size in that area in 23 years. Some have never been recorded there at all in our modern records. And the biggest one, that 5.6, was the strongest earthquake on its fault in 75 years. One seismologist said it was the strongest in the region since 1940. Think about that. World War II had not even started for the United States yet. That is how long this fault waited before it decided to move. That is not normal, and scientists know it. This is the kind of activity that makes the people who study earthquakes for a living stop what they are doing and start paying very close attention. Now, here is the part that should really get your attention. Mendocino County, where most of this activity is happening, put together a disaster plan this year. In that plan, they used federal software to model what would happen if one of these faults produced a magnitude 7.4 earthquake. The answer came back at over $1 billion in direct damage, not for Los Angeles, not for San Francisco. For a rural county with small towns and forests and winding mountain roads, $1 billion. And here's the kicker. A bigger earthquake on the more famous San Andreas fault would actually cause less damage to this county than a smaller one on the Maacama fault. Why? Because the San Andreas runs offshore in this region, away from where people live. The Maacama runs directly underneath their homes, their schools, their grocery stores, and the highway that connects all of them. So what is going on under Northern California right now? Why are these two faults suddenly shaking after years of silence? Is the ground just stretching, or is something much bigger building up down there? That is exactly what we are going to break down today. We are going to look at where these earthquakes are happening, why scientists are watching them so closely, what happened the last time California ignored a fault just like these, and what all of this actually means for the people who live there. Before we get into all of that, if you want to stay informed about earthquakes and natural events as they happen, go ahead and hit that subscribe button. This channel covers these events in real time with real data in plain language. No hype, no fear, just the facts you need to understand what is going on. When the ground starts shaking, you are going to want to already be here. Hit subscribe and let's keep going. Section 2. The faults nobody talks about. Okay, so when most people think about California earthquakes, one name pops into their head right away. The San Andreas fault. It is the big one, the famous one, the one that gets mentioned in every disaster movie and every news report. And that reputation is well earned. The San Andreas runs almost the entire length of the state. It has caused some of the most destructive earthquakes in American history, including the one that destroyed much of San Francisco back in 1906. But here is something a lot of people do not realize. The San Andreas does not carry all of the pressure by itself. It is more like the main highway in a system of roads. And running right alongside that main highway, there are smaller roads that carry some of the same traffic. Think of it this way. The ground under California is being squeezed. Two massive pieces of the Earth's surface, the Pacific Plate and the North American Plate, are grinding past each other. The San Andreas handles most of that motion, but not all of it. Maybe 10 to 20% of that motion gets picked up by other faults running next to it. Smaller faults, yes. Less famous, absolutely. But still big enough to cause real problems when they finally let go. Two of those smaller faults are the ones causing all the trouble right now. Their names are the Maacama fault and the Bartlett Springs fault. And even though you have probably never heard of them, they are more dangerous than most people realize. Let's start with the Maacama. The Maacama fault runs about 110 miles through Northern California, from Healdsburg and Sonoma County all the way up to Laytonville in Mendocino County. That is a long fault. To put it in perspective, The earthquake that hit Napa in 2014 and caused $1 billion in damage happened on a fault that was only about 35 miles long. The Maacama is more than 3 times that length. And here's the part that matters most for the people who live there. The Maacama does not run through empty wilderness. It passes directly under towns, Ukiah, Willits, Hopland. It follows the Highway 101 corridor, which is the lifeline for all these communities. If this fault were to produce a major earthquake, the shaking would not be far away. It would be right under people's feet. The Maacama moves at about 8 millimeters per year. That is roughly 1/3 of an inch. When you hear that number, it sounds like nothing. 1/3 of an inch? That is thinner than a pencil. How much damage could that possibly do? But here's the trick. That is 1/3 of an inch per year that the fault wants to move but cannot. The rocks on either side are stuck together, locked. They are gripping each other like 2 hands pushing against one another. The pressure wants them to slide, but the friction holds them in place. So the energy builds. Think of it like pulling on a rubber band. You pull it back a little bit every day. On any single day, it looks fine, no big deal. But after weeks and months and years of pulling, that rubber band is stretched tight. It is vibrating with stored energy. And at some point, your fingers cannot hold on anymore, and it snaps. That snap is an earthquake. 1/3 of an inch per year does not sound like much. But do the math. Over 10 years, that is over 3 inches of motion that the fault wants to make but has not. Over 100 years, that is nearly 3 feet of stored energy locked up in the rock, waiting. Over 500 years, you're talking about more than 10 feet of motion that has been held back. 10 feet. That is taller than a basketball hoop. All of that energy, all of that pressure, stored in solid rock. And one day, the rock cannot hold it anymore. It lets go. And all those years of stored motion happen in a few seconds. The ground lurches, buildings shake, the earth roars. That is what an earthquake is. It is not the earth opening up and swallowing things. It is years and years of stored energy all being released at once. Now let's talk about the Bartlett Springs fault. If the Maacama is the overlooked cousin of the San Andreas, then the Bartlett Springs is the forgotten one, the one nobody invites to Thanksgiving dinner, the one that sits in the corner and nobody checks on. It runs for about 100 to 120 miles through the northern coast ranges, cutting through some of the most remote and rugged terrain in California. We are talking about thick national forest land, steep mountain ridges where the roads are narrow and winding, places where you can drive for an hour without seeing another car. It passes near Lake Pillsbury through the Mendocino National Forest, near the Berryessa Snow Mountain National Monument. Because so few people live along it, very few scientists have spent time or money studying it. Why would they? There's no major city sitting on top of it, no highway running along it, no university nearby sending students out to dig trenches and measure things. It just sits there in the wilderness, doing its thing, mostly ignored. One geologist described it as one of the least studied fault systems in Northern California. Think about that for a second. A fault that is 100 miles long, a fault that could produce a magnitude 7 earthquake. And scientists are basically saying, yeah, we do not really know that much about it. That should make you a little uncomfortable. The Bartlett Springs fault moves at about 1/4 of an inch per year, even slower than the Maacama. But scientists who have dug research trenches across the fault found physical evidence of at least 3 major earthquakes that happened in the prehistoric past. The most recent one struck somewhere between 300 and 1,000 years ago. For an earthquake to leave marks that are still visible in the dirt hundreds of years later, it usually has to be at least a magnitude 7. The ground has to crack open, shift, and leave a scar that survives centuries of rain, erosion, and new soil building up on top. So we know for a fact that this fault has produced huge earthquakes before, and it has had anywhere from 300 to 1,000 years to build up pressure since the last one. At 1/4 of an inch per year, that is somewhere between 6 feet and 20 feet of stored motion, locked up in the rocks, ready to snap. Now here is where it gets really important. These 2 faults are not separate, isolated systems. They are connected. They are both part of the broader San Andreas family. They run parallel to the San Andreas and to each other. They meet up near the town of Santa Rosa, where multiple faults all converge in a messy tangle of cracks, like a junction where several highways all merge into each other. That junction is important, really important. And it sits right near one of the most geologically active spots in all of California, a place called the Geysers. This is a remnant volcanic system south of Clear Lake, where the earth is still hot enough underground to produce steam and heat water. The geysers produce earthquakes constantly, magnitude 2s, 3s, 4s, all the time. In the past year and a half, they have had several magnitude 4 earthquakes. This constant activity is like someone constantly poking and prodding the nearby faults, adding a little more stress here, a little more pressure there. And the geysers sit right at the junction where the San Andreas, the Maacama, and the Bartlett Springs all come close together. That is not a coincidence. The volcanic system is clearly connected to the fault system. And all that constant small earthquake activity is continuously loading energy onto the bigger faults nearby. So why does this junction matter so much? Because if one fault starts to slip, it can transfer stress to the others. It can push the neighboring fault closer to its breaking point. And in a worst-case scenario, multiple faults could slip at the same time, creating a single, combined earthquake that is much larger than anything either fault would produce on its own. Scientists estimate that the Maacama and the Bartlett Springs could each produce earthquakes up to about magnitude 7 on their own. But if sections of these faults were to rupture together, or if they ruptured at the same time as other connected faults nearby, the number could potentially go even higher, maybe a 7.5. That would release about 5 times more energy than a 7.0. That is a massive difference. So we have 2 long faults, both building pressure, both connected to each other and to the San Andreas, both capable of producing major earthquakes. And right now, for the first time in the modern record, both of them are acting up at the same time. To understand just how unusual that is, we need to look at what has happened over the past few months. Because the timeline of events this summer is where this story goes from interesting to genuinely alarming. Section 3, a summer of shaking. It started on a Wednesday morning in late June. At about 8:10 a.m. on June 24th, the ground under Mendocino County started to roll. Within seconds, it turned violent. Shelves emptied themselves. Bottles of motor oil, wine, and cleaning supplies crashed to the floor in stores across the town of Willits. A window at Jellos Market shattered and sprayed glass across the sidewalk. A section of roof caved in on a home in Redwood Valley. The walls of a Napa auto parts store split apart with a visible crack running down the outside. An auto parts store owner who had been in business for 42 years started sweeping motor oil off her floor. One woman who had lived in the area for over 54 years said it was the biggest earthquake she had ever felt in her life. A home builder described the moment the gentle rolling turned into something else entirely. He said it suddenly jolted, like something slapped the side of his house. He said he genuinely thought the whole structure was about to slide right off its foundation. Another resident said it sounded like a freight train running through their living room. At a gas station in Willits, the store manager watched as merchandise tumbled off every shelf in the store. Across town at George's Geodes and Gems, falling rocks and crystals smashed right through the front window. Over at the Mendocino County Superior Courthouse in Ukiah, people evacuated the building and stood in the parking lot, waiting for inspectors to check whether it was safe to go back inside. The Safeway in Willits had to close because so much product had fallen off the shelves that you could barely walk through the aisles. Smashed jars, spilled liquids, crushed boxes. The grocery outlet closed too. The liquor store next door was left with hundreds of shattered bottles covering the floor. The earthquake measured 5.6. It happened on the Maacama Fault about 7 miles north of Redwood Valley, roughly 5 miles underground. Researchers at the UC Berkeley Seismology Lab confirmed it was the largest earthquake on that fault in recorded history. Veteran California seismologist Lucy Jones, one of the most respected earthquake experts in the country, called it the strongest in the region since 1940. The shaking only lasted about 6 seconds, but in those 6 seconds, the earth made its point. Earthquake alerts blasted out across Northern California. Nearly 657,000 people got a warning on their phones. Some alerts initially pegged the quake at a magnitude 6.0 before it was revised downward. At the peak, 10,000 homes and businesses lost power. Several communities reported interruptions to their water service as utility workers scrambled to check pipes for leaks. And then, in the weeks that followed, something strange started happening. Something you do not hear about very often after earthquakes, but something that tells you a lot about what happened underground. Springs that had been bone dry started flowing with water. Wells that people relied on for drinking water, wells that used to produce just a trickle, suddenly began gushing. Some of them were pumping out more water than they ever had before. In Redwood Valley, water was showing up in places where there had been no water before, just appearing out of the ground, flowing across fields and yards, filling up ditches that had been dry for years. What happened was this. The earthquake shook the ground hard enough to open up new cracks and fractures deep in the rock. Underground water that had been trapped or blocked suddenly had new paths to follow, new tunnels basically, and the water took them, rushing upward and outward and reaching the surface in places nobody expected. This is something that does happen after big earthquakes. Scientists even saw it after the Napa earthquake in 2014. But it tells you something really important. It tells you that the 5.6 was not just a surface-level event. It was not just shelves shaking and windows rattling. It reached deep enough into the earth to physically rearrange the underground rock. It changed the plumbing beneath the surface. It reshaped the landscape from the inside out. On one hand, this had a silver lining. Some people who had been struggling with dry wells suddenly had plenty of water. In a drought-prone state like California, that is not nothing. But on the other hand, it showed just how much force was released by that earthquake. And it raised the question of whether even more force is still stored up down there, waiting for its turn. Now, here is the detail that made scientists pay extra attention. And this is a really important part of the story, so stay with me. After most big earthquakes, you get a swarm of aftershocks. The main fault lets go, and then all the smaller cracks and fractures around it rattle and settle for days or weeks, sometimes even months. Think of it like dropping a heavy book on a wooden table. You get the big slam, and then the table vibrates and bounces and makes noise as it settles down. Those vibrations are like aftershocks. They are the earth settling back into place after the main event. After a 5.6, you would normally expect a decent number of aftershocks. Maybe a few in the magnitude 3 to 4 range, maybe even a 4 plus. That is how it usually works. The bigger the main earthquake, the more aftershocks you get, and the stronger some of them can be. The 2014 Napa earthquake, which was a 6.0, produced over 4,600 aftershocks in the 2 years that followed. That is what a normal pattern looks like. But after the 5.6 on the Maacama fault, that did not really happen. There were just a handful of small aftershocks, a 2.7 here, a 2.6 there, a 2.5. Nothing significant, no big swarm, no cascade of smaller earthquakes suggesting that the fault had fully let go of its energy and was settling down. This is one of those things that sounds like good news on the surface. Oh, no aftershocks? Great, it is over. But to people who study earthquakes, it can actually mean the opposite. When a big earthquake does not produce a proper aftershock swarm, it raises a really important question. Did the fault fully release its stored energy and we just got lucky with a clean break? Or is there still more energy locked up down there, held in place by rocks that did not quite let go, still waiting to come out? That question hung in the air for about 2 weeks, and then the Bartlett Springs fault started answering it. Then July arrived, and the Bartlett Springs fault started talking. On July 10th, a swarm of at least 6 earthquakes rolled through north of Covelo over the course of a few hours. The biggest one measured 4.4. It was shallow, only about 6 miles deep, which made it feel stronger at the surface. People felt it in Ukiah, Willits, and Fort Bragg, towns spread across the entire county. For the Bartlett Springs fault, a 4.4 is a big deal. The last significant earthquake on that fault was a 5.1 back in 2016, and before that, you had to go back over 50 years. The area near Covelo had only produced a tiny handful of magnitude 4 plus earthquakes in the entire 25-year record since 2000, and 2 of them had now happened within the same month. Then on July 28th, another hit. A 4.2 near Cloverdale further south along the same fault system. Scientists checked the records. The last time a magnitude 4 or greater struck that specific area was in 2003. Before that, you have to go back to January 2000, when 3 earthquakes in the 4.2 to 4.6 range struck within a single week. So for 23 years, that area was silent, then it woke back up. And then August came, and the pace picked up even more. On August 4th, a 4.1 struck near Covelo on the Bartlett Springs fault. The next day, August 5th, a 4.1 and a 4.5 hit back-to-back, separated by just 1 second. Same area, same fault. People felt the shaking from Covelo all the way up to Eureka and Arcata on the coast, over 100 miles away. The Redwood Coast Tsunami Work Group put out a notice, noting that this was part of a new sequence of earthquakes on the Bartlett Springs fault. Let me line all of this up so you can see the full timeline. June 24th, magnitude 5.6 on the Maacama fault, biggest in 75 years. Buildings damaged, power knocked out to thousands. Springs start flowing from new cracks. July 10th, magnitude 4.4 on the Bartlett Springs fault near Covelo, part of a swarm of 6 quakes. July 28th, magnitude 4.2 near Cloverdale, first of its size in 23 years. August 4th, magnitude 4.1 near Covelo, Bartlett Springs fault again. August 5th, magnitude 4.1 and 4.5 hit 1 second apart. Same area, same fault. Felt over 100 miles away. That is 2 different faults, both over 100 miles long, both connected to the same system, both firing off notable earthquakes in a span of about 6 weeks. And the level of activity has no comparison in the modern earthquake record for this region. Something is happening down there. The question is whether it is just the earth adjusting and settling, or whether it is a warning sign of something much larger on the way. To answer that, it helps to look at what happened the last time California had a fault that nobody was paying attention to. Because this is not the first time a quiet, overlooked fault in California suddenly woke up and caught everyone off guard. The last time it happened, the results were devastating, and the fault that caused the damage was shorter and weaker than both of the faults we are talking about today. Section 4, when California ignored a fault. There is a story from California's recent past that keeps coming up in conversations about what is happening in Northern California right now. It is a story about what happens when a fault that nobody is watching suddenly decides to move. In the early morning hours of August 24th, 2014, a magnitude 6.0 earthquake ripped through Napa, California. It hit at 3:20 in the morning while most of the city was sound asleep. People were in their beds. The streets were empty. The bars and restaurants had closed hours earlier. And then the ground moved. The shaking was violent and sudden. Parking structures collapsed on top of cars, crushing them flat. Walls and buildings that had stood for over a century crumbled like sandcastles. At the Alexandria Square building in downtown Napa, one of the most recognizable structures in the city, the damage was so bad it looked like a bomb had gone off. Windows shattered across entire city blocks in nearby Vallejo. A water main broke on Mare Island. Homes on 4th Street were so heavily damaged they looked like they might fall over. One restaurant owner later said that if the earthquake had hit just 1 hour earlier, when hundreds of people were still leaving the bars, the casualties could have been catastrophic. As it was, one person died. Over 200 were injured. More than 2,000 structures were damaged. Nearly 100 buildings were declared unsafe to enter. The total economic impact was estimated at up to $1 billion. It was the strongest earthquake to hit the San Francisco Bay Area since the famous Loma Prieta earthquake of 1989, which had collapsed a section of the Bay Bridge and a freeway in Oakland. But here's the part of this story that matters most for our purposes. The earthquake happened on a fault called the West Napa Fault. And before that night, most people, including many scientists, did not think of it as a major threat. It was known to exist, sure, but it was not on anyone's top 10 list of dangerous California faults. It was the kind of fault that got a line or two in a research paper and then got passed over for more famous ones. Then it ruptured, and suddenly everyone wanted to know everything about it. After the earthquake, researchers went back and studied the fault in detail. What they found was unsettling. The fault was longer than they had thought. About 9 miles longer, extending further north toward Calistoga. That extra length meant the fault could produce even bigger earthquakes than the 6.0 that had just caused $1 billion in damage. Updated research now suggests the West Napa Fault could produce something close to a magnitude 7. A magnitude 7 releases about 32 times more energy than a 6.0. It is not just a little bit worse, it is an entirely different scale of destruction. The lesson is simple, and it applies directly to what is happening right now. We do not always know how dangerous a fault is until it breaks. The maps are incomplete. The research has gaps. And sometimes the fault that causes the disaster is one that was barely on anyone's radar. Now think about the Bartlett Springs fault and the Maacama fault. The Bartlett Springs is literally described by experts as one of the least studied fault systems in Northern California. It runs through remote mountains where almost nobody lives, so nobody spent much time or money studying it. The Maacama has gotten more attention, but even on that fault, the 5.6 in June was called the largest earthquake in recorded history. Both of these faults are longer than the West Napa Fault. Both are less studied. Both are connected to the same giant system that includes the San Andreas, and both of them are shaking right now. Mendocino County took this seriously enough to model the worst-case scenario. Their 2026 hazard mitigation plan ran the numbers on a magnitude 7.4, hitting the Maacama Fault at 5 p.m. on a normal day. The results paint a grim picture. Over $1 billion in direct economic losses. Remember, this is for a county that is mostly rural. The damage comes from the fact that the Maacama runs directly under the towns where people live and work. The plan even compared that scenario to a bigger earthquake on the more famous San Andreas. A 7.8 on the San Andreas in this region would cause about $264 million in damage to Mendocino County, less than a quarter of what the Maacama 7.4 would cause. The reason is geography. The San Andreas runs offshore here, away from population centers. The Maacama runs under them. A smaller earthquake on a closer fault does more damage than a bigger earthquake far away. That is one of the most important things to understand about earthquake risk. It is not just about the size, it is about where it happens. And the faults that are shaking right now are the ones that run under people's homes. The county's plan also highlighted a specific type of building that would be hit hardest. Unreinforced masonry. That means older buildings made of brick and concrete block without steel reinforcement. These buildings were built before modern earthquake codes required structures to be able to flex during shaking. When a big earthquake hits, these buildings do not flex. They crack, they crumble, they collapse. Many of the small towns along these faults have buildings like this. Stores, shops, and older homes that have stood for decades without a major earthquake testing them. The 5.6 in June already gave us a preview. It cracked a store wall, shattered windows, dropped part of a roof, knocked merchandise off every shelf in a gas station, sent 657,000 earthquake alerts to phones across Northern California. And that was only a 5.6. Here is something most people do not know about how earthquake magnitudes work. The scale is not like a normal number line. Going from 5 to 6 to 7 is not like going from 1 to 2 to 3. Each whole number jump is about 32 times more energy. So a magnitude 7 releases roughly 1,400 times more energy than a 5.6. That is not just a little bit worse. That is an entirely different kind of event. The difference between a campfire and a wildfire. Now, I want to be very clear about something. None of this means a magnitude 7 is going to hit tomorrow. Earthquakes do not work on a schedule that anyone can read. It could happen next week, It could happen in 50 years. It could be 200 years away. Nobody knows. And anyone who claims to know is not being straight with you. But what scientists can tell you is this: the ingredients are there. The faults are long enough. The pressure has been building for centuries. The recent activity is the most unusual they have seen in the modern record. And when you look at the history of earthquakes in California, the pattern of smaller earthquakes ramping up before a bigger one is something that has been observed before. Sometimes before a big earthquake, the fault starts sending signals. It produces a series of smaller earthquakes in the weeks or months leading up to the main event. Scientists call these foreshocks. You can think of them like warning shots. The fault is not quite ready to fully break, but it is getting close. Pieces of it are slipping. Cracks are forming. The stress is reaching a breaking point. The frustrating truth is that you can never identify a foreshock for certain until after the big one hits. Looking backward, it is obvious. Oh, those smaller earthquakes were foreshocks. They were warnings. We should have known. Looking forward, in real time, you cannot say for sure whether a smaller earthquake is a foreshock for something bigger, or whether it is just a standalone event that will settle down on its own. But here is what we know about the current situation. The 5.6 on the Maacama fault did not produce a normal swarm of aftershocks. That is notable. The Bartlett Springs fault, sitting right next to it in the same connected system, is now producing its most significant earthquake activity in decades. 2 connected faults, both showing elevated activity in a compressed window of time. That is exactly the kind of pattern that makes scientists sit up and pay attention. Does it guarantee something bigger is coming? No, nothing guarantees that, but it puts this region higher on the watch list than it has been in a very, very long time. And the people who live there deserve to know that. And there's a bigger picture here too. What is happening in Northern California is not happening alone. It is part of a much larger pattern. In December 2024, a magnitude 7.0 earthquake struck off the coast near Cape Mendocino. That was the strongest earthquake on the north coast since 1992. It happened right at the spot where the San Andreas fault system crashes into the Cascadia subduction zone, one of the most complicated and potentially dangerous areas on the entire planet. That junction point sits just north of where all this recent activity has been happening. In 2022, there was magnitude 6.4 activity near Ferndale, also on the north coast. In 2019, the Ridgecrest earthquakes in Southern California loaded extra stress onto the Garlock Fault, which scientists now estimate has about 30% more stored energy than it did before. And then there is the San Andreas itself. The southern section of the San Andreas Fault, the part that runs through the desert east of Los Angeles, has not ruptured in over 220 years. That is the longest gap between major earthquakes on that section in the entire record. It is like a pressure cooker that has been building steam for over 2 centuries. At some point, the lid has to blow. Meanwhile, globally, the Earth has been unusually active. In 2025, a massive 8.8 struck Kamchatka, Russia. A 7.5 and 7.2 doublet hit Venezuela. There were major earthquakes in Myanmar, the Cayman Islands, Mexico, and the Philippines. When you add up all the energy released by earthquakes in 2025, it was nearly triple the amount released in the second most active year of the recent past. And 2026 has kept the pace going. Major earthquakes in the Philippines, New Zealand, and Mexico. The 5.6 in Northern California. More activity at that volatile triple point off the coast. The Earth is not calming down. It is still revved up. All of this activity is connected through the same planetary system of stress and movement. When a big earthquake happens on one side of the Pacific, it sends waves of energy rippling outward. Those waves are tiny by the time they reach other faults, but they add up. Every earthquake shifts the stress around, pushing some faults a little closer to their breaking point and pulling others a little further from it. The faults in Northern California are part of this system. They sit in one of the most tectonically active zones on the planet. They absorb the ripples from everything that happens around them. And right now, they are starting to respond. Let me also add one more thing about the San Andreas that ties all of this together. The San Andreas handles most of the plate motion in California. It is the main road, but as long as it stays locked, all that stress has to go somewhere. And some of it ends up on the Maacama and the Bartlett Springs faults, the smaller roads running alongside. So every year that the San Andreas does not rupture, these subsidiary faults take on a little more pressure, a little more strain, a little more stored energy. It is like a backed up pipe. If the main drain is blocked, the water finds other ways out. It pushes through smaller pipes. It builds up behind them. And eventually, something gives. The question is not whether these faults will produce a major earthquake. That is certain. The evidence of past earthquakes is physically carved into the ground, preserved in layers of rock and soil for centuries. The only question is when. And right now, for the first time in a very long time, the ground in Northern California is giving us something to think about, maybe even something to worry about. Section 5. What this means for you. So let's put this all together. Northern California has 2 major faults that most people have never heard of. The Maacama Fault and the Bartlett Springs Fault. Both are over 100 miles long. Both run through or near communities where people live. Both are capable of magnitude 7 earthquakes that could cause over $1 billion in damage. And this summer, both of them have been shaking in ways that have no match in the modern record. A 5.6 that was the biggest in 75 years. A string of 4.0 to 4.5 earthquakes that are the first of their size in over 2 decades. New springs flowing from freshly cracked rock. 2 faults in the same connected system, both active at the same time. Does this guarantee a big earthquake is coming soon? No. Nobody can promise that, and nobody should try. Earthquakes are unpredictable. The next big one on these faults could come next month, or it could come in 100 years. What scientists can say is that the conditions exist for a major earthquake, and the recent activity is more unusual than anything they have seen in the available records. California has been caught off guard before. The West Napa Fault was barely studied when it produced a $1 billion earthquake in 2014. The Bartlett Springs Fault is even less understood today than the West Napa Fault was back then. So what should you actually do with all of this information? The answer is not to panic. Panicking helps nobody. The answer is to prepare. Because here is the reality. If a major earthquake hits, the first 72 hours are on you. Emergency services will be overwhelmed. Roads might be blocked. Power will be out. Cell towers might be down. For the first few days, you and your family are your own rescue team. So have a go bag ready. This is just a backpack or a duffel bag that you can grab and walk out the door with in 30 seconds. Inside it, pack enough supplies for at least 72 hours. Water is the most important thing. You need about 1 gallon per person per day. Pack food that does not need to be cooked or refrigerated. Granola bars, canned food with a pull tab, peanut butter, dried fruit. Throw in a flashlight with extra batteries, a basic first aid kit, any medications you take every day, copies of important documents like your ID and insurance info, some cash and small bills, and a phone charger cable. If you can afford it, get a portable backup battery, something in the 1 to 2 kilowatt hour range. These are not super expensive anymore, and they are worth their weight in gold when the power goes out. When the 5.6 hit in June, it knocked out power to 10,000 people. Some areas were dark for most of the day. A bigger earthquake would knock out far more, and it would take much longer to restore. Having a battery means you can charge your phone, keep a light on at night, and stay connected to information when everything else goes dark. Know where the safest spots are in your home. If the shaking starts, drop to the ground, get under a sturdy desk or table and hold on. Stay away from windows. Stay away from tall bookshelves, heavy mirrors, or anything mounted on the wall that could fall on you. Do not run outside during the shaking. More people get hurt by falling debris outside than inside. And talk about it with your family. Not in a scary way, just in a practical way, like you would talk about what to do if there is a fire. If an earthquake hits while everyone is in different places, where do you meet up? Who do you call first? What is the plan? Having a plan and knowing what to do takes away a lot of the fear. It turns something scary into something you can handle. One more thing. If you live in an older building, especially one made of brick or concrete block without reinforcement, it is worth knowing that those buildings are the most vulnerable in a strong earthquake. Talk to your landlord or look into whether your building has been retrofitted. Many California communities have programs to help with this. The ground under Northern California has been talking all summer long, louder than it has in decades. Maybe it is just stretching. Maybe it is warming up for something much bigger. Nobody can say for sure. But either way, the smart move is exactly the same. Pay attention, be ready, and take care of each other. That is going to wrap it up for today. If you found this helpful, smash that like button and subscribe so you are here for the next update. Drop a comment below and let me know, have you felt any of these recent earthquakes? If you live anywhere near these faults, I want to hear about your experience. What did it feel like? Were you ready for it? Thanks for watching. I will see you in the next one.